I never thought I was going to be a dog lawyer, but as a disability lawyer, I get about 2 calls a week from people that have emotional support animals or service animals claiming that their rights have been violated and wanting to know more, or people that want to know more. And this is one of these hot topics. And it's a very useful topic, too, when you have children with disabilities who parents or who they want to find some other way in which to care for their own disabilities. This has been a really hot topic recently. And there was recently a case in the Supreme Court, the Fry case, and here's a picture of Elena Fry and Wonder the service dog, who's on the steps of the Supreme Court, and we're going to talk about that. And Elena Fry has cerebral palsy, and her case went all the way up to the court, and it was decided this year in her favor in the Supreme Court. And then the next one is Anthony Merchante and Stevie, the service dog. And Anthony has CP, and he has an epilepsy detection dog, and that was in Broward County. But there's a big difference between a dog like Stevie and Wonder and a courthouse dog. And one of the goals today is to decide what dogs are what animals are what, and what animals should be in certain places. Whoops, now let me go back. So, the questions we have is, what is an emotional support animal? What is a service animal? What's a therapy animal? And what's a pet? The first one is Easter the turkey, who was a viral internet sensation when somebody took a picture of her in an airplane. George the monkey, Lassie the dog, Princess Boo Boo in the purse, who we see at every single Starbucks, Guide Dog Sam, or Professor Fuzzy Paws McWhiskerface. See, these are things that I've always wanted to say. I went to law school, 20 years of trial practice. I get to stand up in front of 400 people and say, Professor Fuzzy Paws McWhiskerface. So is Professor McWhiskerface an assistance animal? And these are the questions that you have to ask. Is the user a person with a disability? Is it a service animal, an emotional support animal? Is it a therapy animal? And again, I don't know how people get clothes on a cat. That takes a whole nother skill. Is a professor allowed in a hospital or a courthouse? Is a professor allowed in a condominium that does not allow pets? Is a professor allowed in an airplane? Types of assistance animals. There's service animals, emotional support animals, therapy animals, and facility dogs. This is a cartoon from Bloom County where Opus and Bill are punishment support animals because Binkley was in the corner and they want to help Binkley with his rights. So what is a service animal under the Americans with Disabilities Act? A service animal are only 2 animals, a dog or a miniature horse. And the important thing is they have to be trained to assist a person with a disability. A service animal is permitted in all public accommodations in state and local governmental facilities. There are certain rules. The animals must be under the handler's control. The animal must be housebroken. A service animal must have a harness, leash, or other tether unless the handler is unable because of a disability to use a harness. A public entity is not responsible for the care or supervision of a service animal. But also, service animals don't have to be for people with visible disabilities. They could also be for people that have psychological disabilities as well. Helping an individual with psychiatric or neurological disability by preventing or interrupting impulsive or destructive behaviors. Reminding an individual with mental illness to take prescribed medications. Calming an individual with post-traumatic stress disorder during an anxiety attack. For example, there's trained service animals that prevent people from autism from eloping, that block them from going to a certain area. So a service animal is always customized to a person's disability, or not customized, individually trained. But there's only 2 questions that a public accommodation could ask. Number 1, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And 2, what work or task has that dog been trained to perform? Staff is not allowed to ask for documentation. You can't go to a courthouse and somebody asks for papers for your dog. Or please demonstrate your dog's task or require about the nature of the person's disability. The cartoon to the side says, hey dude, can you send that service dog for some ketchup? So the important things to notice about service dogs is there's no official licenses or registrations for service dogs. Why? Because the service dog is individually trained for that person's disability. In the first picture you saw was a picture of Elena Fry. She has a dog because of her cerebral palsy. It helps her pick things up. It helps her open doors. The next dog was Stevie. Stevie is an epileptic, is a seizure dog. He's not trained to open doors. He's only trained to detect when Anthony has a seizure, to lie on his chest and to lick him to make sure that he's calm. That's what the dog is trained to do. So there's no official licenses or registrations because each dog is individually trained to that person's disability. A public accommodation cannot exact a surcharge from a service animal user. The hotel can't charge you additional money, but it can charge you money for damage caused. A service animal must be under the control of its user or tethered to the user. The service animal can only be barred from a facility where it may be a direct threat to others or fundamental alteration to the facility. For example, a sterile environment, or you wouldn't want to bring your service dog to a raptor exhibit with big eagles flying over and things like that. Okay, let's talk about Fry. Fry was the case that just came down from the Supreme Court, and this is one of the things I love. This was a petition for certiorari that was submitted to the Supreme Court, and Elena signed it, who is Fry's handler, and Fry stamped it with her paw print. I think this is the only Supreme Court petition ever that actually has a paw print on it. Fry is important because if a person is a child and goes to school and has an issue involving the ADA or similar law, the Rehabilitation Act, what they have to do before they have a complaint is they have to go through the educational process, the IDEA, which requires administrative preconditions. It requires a due process hearing if there's an issue. And Fry, Elena needed Wonder the service dog because it was strictly an access issue. I can't get into the school. I'm not allowed to have the independence that I choose to have because the school is not allowing the dog. The school could say, you could have a one-on-one aid. You could do this, you could do that. But the importance of having a service dog for Elena was it gave her the independence that she needed, and that was important. And that's important for a lot of service animal users, and they said no. And the lower court said, in that case, that you have to go through the administrative preconditions. And they didn't want to, and they took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. If it's an access issue, if it's the same issue that you would have at a public accommodation or a library, you don't have to go through the administrative preconditions that, of the IDEA that you would have to do in a school. So she can go directly to court and say, I'm not allowed to have admission to the school. That's important for all children with disabilities because there's many things that children with disabilities need that do not involve the educational modalities involved under the IDEA. It could be they need an accessible bathroom on their floor. They need to have a sign language interpreter if they're in high school and it's not part of learning ASL. They need to have they need to have items in Braille. Those issues that just involve access, you don't have to go through the IDEA process. But with Fry, that was important because of the fact that before Fry, you would have to go through a long process before you even had that right. On the other hand, in the first picture I showed you with Stevie and Anthony, this was in Florida, and in Florida they decided that you didn't have to go through administrative preconditions before Fry came out. But Fry is a Supreme Court case. The other issue you always see are emotional support animals. Emotional support animals are under the Fair Housing Act, and they permit any and all types of animals, subject to the animal being a direct threat to the health and safety of others or unreasonable, to be an emotional support animal that provides emotional support, well-being, comfort, or companionship for a person with a mental illness or psychiatric disability. It could be any type of animal. It could be a snake, it could be a lizard, it could be a ferret, it could be a chicken, it could be anything that you could think of. It could be a rat, it could be a monkey. Monkeys are not considered service animals under the ADA because when they looked at the regulations and specifically made them dogs and miniature horses, they believed that monkeys could be a danger because they do tear people's faces off at times. Reasonable accommodations under of the no pets rule under the Fair Housing Act. Where is this important? Now, this is one of my favorite cartoons, Snoopy Come Home. Has anybody seen Snoopy Come Home? Okay. Snoopy Come Home, 1973, Peanuts thing, in which Snoopy went and Snoopy went to visit Lila. That was his first owner. He went to the hospital with Woodstock. He cared for her. And then he went to her house later to live with her, but they had a no dogs allowed policy. This was in 1973, so Snoopy could not live with Lila. Now, under the Fair Housing Act, if the animal is an emotional support animal, the housing provider must allow that animal. And we'll talk about how that's important with regards to foster children later, because it's very important. What animals are permitted under the Fair Housing Act? Any animal is permitted if the animal is necessary for a person with a disability's equal use and enjoyment of the premises. What does necessary mean? It's a very broad definition. Necessary means the animal ameliorates or lessens the effect of the disability. Does it make somebody feel better? Does it calm them if they have anxiety? Does it alleviate the depression? Does it help them sleep at night? What can be requested of a person with a disability? A housing provider may only request reliable disability-related information that, number one, is necessary to verify that the person meets the Fair Housing Act's definition of disability, a substantial impairment that limits a person's daily life activities, describes the need for an accommodation, they need the dog, shows a relationship between the person's disability and the need for the requested accommodation. The dog lessens the effects of the person's depression, anxiety, or other mental condition. Housing providers may not ask for medical records. Housing providers may not ask for medical releases, not statements from doctors, only the information which is necessary, which usually is a letter. It could be a documentation from a physician, psychiatrist, social worker, or other mental health worker that the animal provides emotional support that alleviates one or more of the identified symptoms of an existing disability. Let me tell you about Ajit Bogaita. This was a trial that I had in Orlando. Ajit had this dog, Kane, wonderful, beautiful dog, pit bull. He was a veteran, and he suffered from military sexual trauma. He had letters from the doctor, letters from his doctor at the VA saying that he needs the dog, saying that he suffers from PTSD and the dog assists him with his disability. And the condominium association kept on asking questions. They wanted to know every time he's been treated. They wanted copies of all his medical records. They wanted to speak to his doctor. They wanted to know why he needed a dog that's so big. And the reason why is he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd lash out at the dog. And if you lash out at a little dog, it's going to be very dangerous to the dog. If you lash out at an 80-pound pit bull that's full of muscles, it's not going to hurt the dog too much. So we actually had to try that case, and the dog went in the courtroom with us. And it was wonderful because the dog was the sweetest dog that licked me every time that I sat up and and stood up and sat down. And he was wonderful. But the court found that the condominium association was not allowed to ask those questions. They were only allowed to ask what was absolutely necessary, and it was nobody else's business why he had a disability, just the fact that he had a disability and he needed the dog. But for the letters from a professional, what you need is the relationship between the resident and the medical professional. I'm his treating medical provider, therapist, the type of disability that creates a substantial limitation of a daily life activity, and the nexus between the animal and the disability. So you can't charge a fee, you can't charge a pet deposit, you can't require the use of an alternate elevator, you can't limit the dog to areas of the facility, you cannot require dog insurance, and you can't require the dog to be muzzled. Now, why is this important? And then we're going to go into courthouse dogs next, which, direct threat, and then courthouse dogs. But why is this important? Well, kids that are in the foster care system that are taken away from their parents may have a psychiatric or mental disability. They may suffer from depression, they may suffer from anxiety, they may need additional assistance. And we're getting into a time now in which we say dogs assist people when they go to courtrooms. It makes them feel more comfortable. And I get cases sometimes in which I have probate judges going to me and they're like, how can I separate this older woman from her dogs to put her into an ALF that doesn't allow dogs? How can I do that? In the same way, when you take a child away from their home and they have a pet and they have an animal, is that pet or animal allowed to go with the child? Is that something that is permitted? Does the child have a disability? Is that disability sufficient to make them a qualified person with a disability under the Fair Housing Act? And is the system itself a housing provider? Now, if the system isn't a housing provider, are they otherwise obligated to let the child go with the animal? Now, these are things that is something that is important to think about. These aren't cases that have really come to bear to date, but with all of these people that claim that their dogs are emotional support animals, why not? Do animals help children? We know that they do. Should children have animals as part of their treatment? Does it help them? It all depends on what a doctor says. Of course, you're not going. The issue here is, number one, is this program or facility is a foster care system a program and facility of a governmental entity? It is. So then you have to provide accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. If so, is this an accommodation that's allowed? Now, the question you're going to have first is whether or not the parents, if a child is being sheltered, want to give up possession of the dog, but let's assume that they do, or the cat, or the rabbit, or the hamster. If they do, then the question is, can that child bring the animal with them? And what harm are you causing by not letting that happen? And if so, what obligations do the foster parents have, or the shelter has, to care for that animal? It's all an interesting situation. Now, let me tell you about the case I had involving Stevie and Anthony. You saw their picture in the beginning. Let me get to the beginning. See, this thing doesn't have a thing where I could go to the beginning, but I'm almost there. Anthony and Stevie. Stevie cannot control his dog by himself. He needs assistance in controlling his dog. He cannot handle the dog by himself. The dog is tethered to his wheelchair, or a handler has to handle the dog. Now, the question we had in this case is, what obligation does a school district itself have to care for the dog? The school district claimed that they had no obligation whatsoever to assist with regards to the care and control of Stevie the dog. And we held that, let's say Stevie was able to control his dog by himself. Let's say Stevie, instead of being a little boy with cerebral palsy and epilepsy who is nonverbal, was a 6-year-old blind girl that was able to control the dog. Would the school not help a 6-year-old blind girl who could walk go out and walk the dog? Of course they would. Or would they say that the 6-year-old blind girl has to go out by herself in front of the school and walk the dog? They wouldn't do that. So of course you would do that with Anthony. Anthony is a child who they have to toilet, they have to clean, they have to feed, they have to do everything else. Would it be unreasonable for them to do additional services in order to assist with the dog? The court said no, it wouldn't be unreasonable. And the court granted summary judgment against the school district with regards to the obligation that they did owe Anthony a reasonable accommodation to assist him with the dog and to allow him with the dog. They actually wanted his mother to come in every day to be the dog sitter. And they said, no, Anthony has a one-on-one aide. It would be perfectly reasonable if they do all those other services to do those services with Anthony. Now, the other issue is who pays? Now, we're getting into a different issue. We talked about reasonable accommodations when we talked about the Fair Housing Act, but under the ADA, when you're dealing with the program and service of the public entity, who pays, who's responsible? Who would be responsible if a dog cost more money to feed? Now, these are things that somebody could ask from the CBC. The CBC pays for things such as gift cards, travel, food. Would it be the same thing with the dog? But I do think it may be a great idea in order to expand this to say, this may be a therapeutic issue. Is this part of medical services? These are issues that really haven't arisen yet, but these are things that we should all think of. How can we best serve a child? Now, I was just, before being here, I went to the Wagging Tails session, which was wonderful, with the two therapy dogs. And one of the questions was, now, would a dog help? You know, they see the therapy dogs and they go home. Do you think that they should have a therapy dog? And the question is, why not? When you're dealing with disabilities, the thing to think about is, what is the best way to assist that person with a disability to live as independently as possible and to ameliorate the effects of the disability? And if an animal does it, that's what people are doing. People are getting emotional support animals because it helps them with their depression and their anxiety, in as much as it would help a child with depression and anxiety, and the psychiatric issues that the trauma that a child has to go through. Having a hamster, a rabbit, a dog, a cat would be an acceptable, reasonable accommodation, an acceptable accommodation both under the Fair Housing Act and under the ADA. So these are things that I think about that keep me going all day and keep me up while I'm driving up here thinking, I haven't had a case like that yet. Not the fact that I want one, okay? But when I handle a case like against housing authorities, and you see what accommodations are granted, and these are places that have to provide grab bars and all sorts of ADA issues. About 80% of the accommodations that are requested from public housing authorities involve emotional support animals. So people that know nothing about disability rights usually are the ones that ask for emotional support animals, whether or not they really want to keep their animals or whether or not they have a disability. But my theory on that is, if it's easy enough to get a prescription for Xanax, it should be just as easy to get to have an emotional support animal. Is the dog a direct threat? A dog being a direct threat, the specific animal must pose a direct threat to the safety or would cause substantial physical damage to the property that cannot be reduced by another reasonable accommodation. You may have a pit bull. You may have the middle one, which tells you I'm a child of the 70s. It's Hong Kong Phooey. And the one on the right is a digger. Now, a digger could cause physical damage to the property. How would you reduce it? By another reasonable accommodation. You could put some chicken wire and things like that. And of course, you could say it's not going to dig anymore because the wire's there, which would be a reasonable accommodation that could reduce physical damage. But the issue is a specific animal, and this has come up in Dade County with the pit bull ordinance. How many are you familiar with the pit bull ordinance? Just want to make sure that you're awake. The pit bull ordinance yields to the Fair Housing Act. So if a person claims that they have an emotional support animal, and they're cited by the county for having a pit bull, if they have a true emotional support animal, then they cannot be cited. It is an exception to that rule. Now, one of the things that I've seen and it happened to me today, is somebody sends me these certificates or these tags that say emotional support animal. It has a picture of a Boo-Boo, Princess Boo-Boo, and it says emotional support animal, has a certificate. Those don't mean a thing. Those are things that somebody goes on the internet, they get the tags, they pay $45. They don't indicate whether or not the dog is a emotional support animal. The proof that is needed for that is you need to have a doctor's letter that indicates a person has a disability, that the animal is necessary, and that there's a nexus between the animal and the disability, not an internet-based tag. Dogs in the courtroom. This was a major victory of the Guardian Ad Litem program this past year, was Justice's Best Friend Act, which is phenomenal. And dogs have been in the courtroom for years now, but there hasn't been any standards that courts could follow, really, with regards to whether or not a dog can be in the courtroom or not. And I've had that issue come up in my cases where courts have said this is an emotional support animal and you're in trial, the court's not allowed here, this is not it's not a service animal. But the Justice's Best Friend Act, which was just in the Florida Bar News, basically says the court may set any other conditions it finds just and appropriate when taking the testimony of a victim or witness under the age of 18, a person who has an intellectual disability, or a sexual offense victim or witness, including the use of therapy animal or facility dogs in any proceeding involving sexual offense or child abuse, abandonment, or neglect. Now, the law specifically took out service animals out of this. The reason why is service animals are permitted in any circumstance under the ADA. So it wasn't needed under this law. And they didn't want to limit it under this law either. So by having, if you have a service animal, then this won't really apply. And there's courthouse dogs. The difference between a facility dog and a service dog is a facility dog does not assist a person with a disability. Its user is not a person with a disability. It doesn't have the right to public access. It assists professionals by using dogs to provide emotional support to individuals involved in the criminal justice system and other legal proceedings. Forensic interviews, child advocacy centers, defense interviews, courtroom, treatment courts, and guardian ad litem services. In order for a dog to be a trained service dog, a trained emotional support animal, there I did it wrong again, withdrawn. A trained therapy dog or a facility dog, it has to be a canine good citizen. This is a training from Assistance Dog International, and there are several trainers that do this, and there's a whole test that they have to go through to prove that they are good dogs. And this is a picture of my dog. It's not a good dog. It would not be a canine good citizen. I take it to work every day, and it barks at everybody. It's very shy, and it's not good. It does not accept a friendly stranger, not at all. It has good appearance in grooming sometimes. It does not do a loose lead out on a walk. It pulls me everywhere. Could walk through a crowd. Does not sit down and on command and staying in place unless you were to bribe the dog. Doesn't come when called. Does not have a polite reaction with another dog. He tries to jump on the other dog. Calm reaction to distraction. Supervised separation to another person? No, it doesn't. It whines and cries. So my dog is not a good canine citizen. My dog should not be going to work with me and dealing with my clients. There's some wonderful training facilities. There's Southeast Guide Dog Schools. There is there's canines. There is some very good schools, and it takes thousands upon thousands of dollars to train a service animal and to train a therapy dog. It's hours and hours of time and thousands of dollars. And you could tell a service animal or a therapy animal from a normal dog, because if the dog barks, if the dog jumps, if the dog attacks other dogs, it's not a service animal. A service animal should be a canine good citizen if the animal is trained. A courthouse dog should be a canine good citizen because the animal is trained to do these 9 tasks. But dogs do not have to be courtroom dogs to be in the courtroom. When I have a case, my dogs go to the courtroom when I have a case with a dog. And it's purely up to the court's discretion as to whether or not to allow that dog in the courtroom. And this is what the 11th Circuit said in 2014. A district court abuses its discretion to admit relevant evidence when a decision rests on a clearly erroneous fact-finding, an errant conclusion of law, or an improper application of law to fact. Nothing suggests that the district court's decision in allowing a dog to remain present as a demonstrative exhibit rested on any of the 3. So that's a picture of me, Ajit, and the dog after the trial. The dog was very happy. So it's purely a matter of discretion. Now, this was a case, the State versus Devon D case was a case in Connecticut in 2016 in which a dog was allowed in with a child victim. And the court did a detailed analysis of when the dog was allowed and why the dog was allowed. And the court, again, in this case, found that it was the court's discretionary authority to allow the dog in the courtroom with a child witness. And the court found that the court must take certain things into account. And they found that they should consider 3 issues. And this is for comfort and support to a testifying witness. The particular facts and circumstance for the request to have the dog accompany the particular witness, the extent to which the dog's presence will permit the witness to testify truthfully, competently, and reliably, and the extent to which the dog's presence will obviate the need for more drastic measures to secure the witness's testimony. If a child is scared to death to testify, and the only way the child's going to testify is if the dog's there, then a court will allow the dog. Now, can dogs other than courtroom dogs testify? Yes. It's within the judge's discretion to allow a child witness or an adult witness to testify with a court. It's a balancing that a court's going to have to do. And even in the Justice's Best Friend Act, It leaves that discretion to the court, but gives more guidance for what the court could do in those circumstances. So there is nothing that inherently bars any dog from being used as in a courtroom as a testimonial aid for a witness that needs the dog in order to testify. Now, with regards to courtroom dogs, they're specifically trained not to prejudice the jury because they go under the witness stand. And the person could pet the dog under the witness stand, and they come in and out when the jury is not there, which lessens the prejudicial effect to the jury. With my cases with the dog sitting next to me, it posed a certain danger because if the dog was not a canine good citizen, I was going to lose the case. It's one of these O.J. Simpson moments. If the dog bit me, I might as well just pack up and go home. But the dog licked me, so I won the case. Are there any questions? There are mics somewhere. Yes.
Hold on. We will finish out the video. I'm an attorney at Lytham, and I had a child who was already 17. She was a runaway, came back into care and said she wanted an emotional support animal. And I said, okay, I'll help you do that. How would have I helped her to do that? I actually helped her by getting her an appointment with a psychiatrist and a therapist, and by speaking to the CBC. It didn't go quick enough. She aged out of care. But any suggestions for attorney at Lytham's that have children that say they want emotional support dogs?
Yes, absolutely. And also, there doesn't have to be, if a child has a mental disability and a child has a particular affinity for an animal, you could bring it up as well. But the easy way to do it is, number one, their doctor has to say, it's a good idea, it's going to lessen the effects of the disability. And a lot of times when a child is on an antidepressant or an anti-anxietal, you'd be hard-pressed to find a treating mental health professional to say that. It does not have to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It doesn't even have to be a doctor. It could be the person's therapist. And all the therapist would have to do is write saying, my patient I've been treating this patient for the past year or past week or past whatever, and the person would, I've suggested, prescribed, recommended that the person have an emotional support animal, which will lessen the person's depression, anxiety, or whatever other disability they have. Now the question is, why do they need the letter? Do they need the letter to get a benefit? Do they need the letter to stay in their house? For example, let's say a person is going to school in a dorm. If they had that, any dorm would allow that person to have the dog, the cat, the animal with them in their dorm. So then they can go and they could ask for the accommodation from their dorm in order to do that. If it was to ask for additional services, additional food, additional care from the CBC or whoever will provide those services, then that would be something too to say that this is a person's aid. In my people that don't do disability work often say, isn't there a special test? Isn't there a special thing you need to show? But there's no difference between having an emotional support animal as an accommodation as any other type of accommodation a person would need. So would you have to ask for anything special in order to have a closer parking spot? or to use a different piece of equipment. So it's the same thing. All you need is that letter, and that should be it. Does that answer your question? Where does she get the dog? It could be anywhere. The good thing about emotional support animals is there's no training requirement. So you can get an emotional support animal from the pound. The animal just has to be a good-natured animal and an animal that fits well with that person. I've had people that asked me about emotional support sheep, emotional support snakes. On my Facebook feed yesterday, I sent out a picture of a person that had a chicken in a stroller. So an emotional support animal doesn't have to be a trained animal. It could be any animal. So she could went to the pound and got the animal. Also, there's no requirement to get the letter before the animal. So if a person has depression and they say, I need the dog, or they develop a relationship with the dog, they can go to their doctor afterwards and say, the dog actually helps me with this. So there is no time requirement in order to get a letter. It's just the person has to have a disability, and the dog or animal or reptile or whatever has to lessen the effects of the disability on that person. Yes?
My question, I'm a children's legal service attorney, and I have a sex abuse case coming up, and talking with the guardian ad litem attorney, we were thinking that we will have the child victim testifying. She wants to testify. There won't be no special conditions. It won't be in camera. But we were talking about this very issue of maybe having a therapy dog there while she's testifying. Some of in the Fourth Circuit, we do have some of our guardian ad litems that have therapy dogs. Right. My question would be, for me, legally, do I have to file any type of motion to get permission from the court to agree to that? How would I go? What's the procedure process in having that special accommodation made for this child victim?
That's a really good question. Since the child doesn't have a disability, him or herself, you shouldn't go through the court's accommodation process. If you have a disability, the court has an accommodation process, which is the Rule of Judicial Procedure 2.540, where you can go to the court's ADA coordinator and ask for the accommodation. But when it deals with a courtroom procedure itself, what you should do is you should ask the judge and actually make a written motion with regards to the accommodation, because the other side's definitely going to object, but it's going to be the court's discretion about whether or not the court's going to allow it. But with the new Justice's Best Friend law, it should be a lot easier. You can use that as almost an official stamp of the judge's power to allow dogs, rather than going through all the case law that I used to have to show. Now I'm just going to have the law to say, it's presumptively valid. But yeah, the answer to your question is, I would make a motion before and not surprise the judge at the time that the child's going to testify, because then you're going to have a very unhappy judge. Yes, there was another question?
Some of the accommodations that you spoke of are inanimate, generic. You mentioned closer parking and other accommodations that, well, frankly, are no skin off of anyone else's nose. But when we have an emotional support animal, how do we balance the needs of a child who may need that emotional support animal and the needs of where that child is, such as a foster parent who is severely allergic to animals, mm-hmm. or has their own fear of certain types of animals? How do we balance those needs and still keep our children safe, happy, and healthy?
That's a great question, and that's a question that comes up a lot with regards to emotional support animal cases. How do you have an emotional support animal in a dorm? How do you have it in a building that has people allergic? When it comes to the foster care system, if that does become an issue with regards to what foster parents would be or do have an animal-friendly home and which ones don't, that would be a good question to ask in the first place. But if there is an issue in which a foster parent has a fear, then the question is, could that child go to another foster home that is pet friendly? And if that's not, and if the issue is more the fact that the child should go in this home, then you would have to balance those issues, and you would have to, in circumstances like that, then it would maybe a fundamental alteration or an undue burden to move that child elsewhere if the child has to be in that facility. Usually when it comes to housing, what you would do, let's say it was a dorm, and you had a roommate that was allergic, you would say, okay, you can move from this room to that room. We're just going to switch around the rooms here to be with somebody who is not allergic. Or if it's an apartment where somebody who's allergic, the question is, what type of machine? Can you put an ionizer in? Where does the air blow out? What elevators do the folks go in? And then that's how you balance it out between the needs of the person with a service animal and the needs of others. But if there's no way to balance it out, then you may have a fundamental alteration that you can't surpass. And those are other issues that you have to look at. But you have to look at the totality of the circumstances in situations like that. But the main thing to do is, before that, if the person does have an animal, is to say what foster families are animal friendly versus ones that are not. Yes?
Hold on. We won't get you on the recording if you don't.
Yeah, I need to be on. For children in the foster care system, who pays for the dog food?
That is a phenomenal question. My own personal opinion is the CBC should. That's my own personal opinion, because they pay for other necessaries that a child may have that isn't covered by health services. But there's also an issue of whether or not this would be a covered EPSDT service. Now this is an issue that really hasn't come to me yet, but these are issues that are worth discussion. There's also entities that do pro bono dog food, not pro bono. Dog food doesn't do pro bono. I've just been a lawyer too much, but it would be interesting if dog food did pro bono. There are entities that give away dog food, and with regards to foster children, they may be more apt to do that for their own charity benefit. But once that issue comes to me, I'm sure I'll find a way to tackle that. But that should be the least of a person in foster care's worries and how they will care for the dog or how will they feed the dog. But my own gut is it's a CBC's responsibility.
Over here.
Questions? Yes.
Hi. So mine is kind of the same as this other lady as far as balancing of rights. I've had foster children who were terrified of dogs because they have been traumatized by dogs. They've been bitten, they've been chased, they have been threatened by their abuser with sticking the dogs on them, and are just terrified. And so even in the service animals case, where you're talking about taking a dog to school, my child would be traumatized by having that dog in the school, and whereas the other child needs that child for service, and the same with allergies in the school and that sort of thing. As far as the foster families, we can't even play siblings together half the time. So I'm really not sure about trying to make somebody take a dog because they won't take the sib. But I'm very curious as to whether the Supreme Court addressed that at all.
In public areas, Well, there you have two different disabilities, especially with a child that is that scared, that may rise to the level of having a disability. But again, it's the school system's obligation to balance these different issues out. And if a child is scared to be with, terrified to be with the dog, then again, that child shouldn't be with somebody who does have a dog, whether or not it's a foster family that has a dog, or another child with a dog. So those are the things that you have to balance out, but those are things that you would balance out in a normal daily life, because if people that are visually impaired have guide dogs, what would you do with the child? You would have to find some way in which to tell the child to keep them apart. You see the dog, you're going to leave. But with regards to emotional support animals, again, doesn't have to be a dog. The child could have a hamster. There's cases involving colleges, when colleges at first were not willing to accept any emotional support animals, that somebody actually sued, I think it was University of Kentucky, over a pet rabbit or guinea pig. And it was a whole huge suit for a person who wanted a guinea pig. But it really, the issue with the dog itself and dealing with emotional support animals, it really doesn't matter. It just matters the fact that a person has a connection to something that the person could care for, that assists the person with their own disability, that calms them down. But it could be, people have their chihuahuas that they push around in their carriage that they would die for. So it's all a flexible process. With regards to the difficulty of finding foster homes, the issue with that is it doesn't hurt to ask. Who's pet friendly? Who's not pet friendly? The same thing with kids that may have peanut allergies. Do you have other kids in the house that eat peanut butter? Do you have peanut butter in your house? So these are all things that you may have to ask. I think there was another question.
Yeah.
Right over here.
You mentioned earlier the training. I was wondering who pays, if we're talking about dogs for foster children, and I'm using dogs as the example, who would pay for the training to be the friendly dog? Who would pay for the vet bills and the grooming? And because I think it's more than dog food. So just if we're looking at this as the woman, the attorney ad litem had asked, that this is something that foster kids are asking for, is there any programs that donate these things, or is...
Most of the large-scale pet stores do have programs in which they do donate these things. Do they have something organized with regards to the foster care system? No, not yet. It's a great idea, but I think it's something that should be done, and it could be done. And the question is, how much does this cost, and whether or not this would be a covered service? With regards to dogs and veterans, there's becoming more and more discussions as to whether dogs for veterans with PTSD, are those dogs covered? Is training those dogs covered? Is food for those dogs covered? And that's a whole issue that's rising now with regards to more and more dogs, PTSD dogs, being given to veterans. So it's a very hot topic, and that's something that we should discuss and we should ask about. Right, yep.
Okay. I'm most concerned about, I guess, really just the whole issue. I mean, especially with the emotional support animals, since that's not even just dogs. I mean, some people don't have issues with dogs for allergies and other reasons. But then you're saying emotional support. I mean, you're saying they can have a snake. What about airplanes? What about buses? What about in the apartment? You're walking and you get on the elevator and somebody's got a snake in their hand. I mean,
well, emotional support animals
wonderful.
should be in the home. They're not service animals, so they shouldn't be out in public accommodations. So you're not going to get a person, hopefully, unless you're on Miami Beach, without a snake around their neck. But the issues in planes is actually a lot broader, and there's a whole huge issue. There's a thing called the Air Carrier Access Act that allows emotional support animals on planes if you have a letter from your doctor on the airline's forms. And even sometimes when they're not on the airline's forms, you could bring them. And what the regulations under the ACA say is that if a person has an allergy and there's a service animal and the allergy is so bad the person should have an EpiPen with them, which is an interesting issue when you look at the Air Carrier Access Act. But in everything that we do with regards to disabilities, we deal with a balancing. And we're balancing rights. But again, when I think of the use of medications, and this is my own personal opinion after doing disability rights for 20 years, I'd much rather have a child that has an animal than on anti-anxiety meds or antidepressant meds. But it's, again, when a person deals with their own disability or their guardian deals with a person's disability, they should have the option about what to do and what to pick in order to care for that person's disability. And it does infringe on other people's rights, and there's no doubt about it. And that's where most of my cases deal with about why do we have this dog and we're in a no-dog building. I moved here because I didn't want a dog. But the question is, you have to balance the rights of a person with disability versus other rights and how much it really affects that other person that does not have a disability. Any other questions? Yes. Victor.
Yes. Can you address the issue of service animals and, let's say, a Baker Act receiving facility or a hospital? What would be the rights there?
And a service animal is allowed in a hospital unless it's in a sterile environment. So, and there are very few sterile environments in a hospital. A hospital has more germs than probably anywhere else has. So unless a service animal would not be admitted into places like an operating room, a lab. Service animal is not permitted in the MRI room because you wouldn't want to have a service animal in there with a collar. So there's certain areas that a service animal would not be allowed in. But in any other areas, a service animal would be allowed. The question is, and I've seen clients of mine that have had their service animal in bed with them in a hospital. The issue is, the other issue is if a person is in bed and does not need the service animal, is a service animal still necessary for that person? And that's an issue that comes up at times as well. With regards to a Baker Act receiving facility, the question would be, would the presence of the dog be a fundamental alteration or an undue burden for the Baker Act receiving facility? Is there something that would be a danger, and why is the dog needed? And it would depend upon the individual circumstance of the facility and the person in that circumstance. But it would depend on how it would change the essential nature of the facility. And sometimes I could imagine that having a service dog in some circumstances may not be healthy for the person or for the dog, or may create a danger. In other circumstances, I don't see an issue, but it all depends upon the facility, who's in the facility, and what services are being done. And the other issue you're going to have in a hospital environment or in Baker Act facility is, under the ADA, you have to care for your dog. You have to be in control of your dog. If you cannot care for your dog or be in control of your dog, then you cannot have your dog in the facility. And that's also a problem that you may have. So if you're in a Baker Act facility and you can't walk your dog, you can't require the hospital to walk your dog for you. and that's an issue that may be a problem unless you have somebody pick up your dog, care for your dog, and control your dog. So it would be a whole analysis of how long, why you're in there, and what additional supports that you have while you're in a hospital or Baker Act receiving facility. Any other questions about animals, dogs, service animals, children and dogs, or anything else? Yes, question.
Can you just talk briefly about the safety part? How unsafe does an animal have to be before you can do something? Do they have to actually bite someone? I lived with something, the dog starts growling at people, snaps at people. What point's too much?
In a public accommodation, if an animal starts growling or snapping, it's not under the control of the person. So that animal could be asked to leave. If an animal starts barking in a movie theater, it could be asked to leave. The animal's not under the person's control. In a housing situation, the animal has to be a direct threat. So it really has to, if the animal is barking and just barking, but if the animal is snapping and biting and lunging at a person, then that animal may be a direct threat. It doesn't actually have to bite, it has to pose a threat to the person. So it has to be something in which someone would say, oh my God, the animal's going to bite my face off. It's just not safe being here. Okay. Thank you so much. And by the way, that's my dog, and I take my dog to the office every day, and it's definitely not a good canine citizen, but hopefully it will be.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sure.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you to Matthew. Just want to remind everybody the welcome reception is tonight. This really is out by the pool. I know I keep saying everything's by the pool, but this really is. So please join us for the welcome reception. And don't forget, if you are doing the dine around, make sure you have your iTrolley ticket. And I think the dine around will be fun. Anybody who's in the presentation tomorrow morning will be meeting back here at 5:40 to rehearse for our presentation. And you know who you are, so if you're wondering whether or not you should be here, you probably don't need to be. Thank you all. See you in the morning.